Welcome. On behalf of the National Transit Institute, I thank you for participating in the Review and Update Introduction to Transit Asset Management webinar. The National Transit Institute develops, promotes, and delivers training and education programs for the public transit industry in the United States. The webinar format for today consists of two presentations. For our first presentation, we are pleased to have the following presenters with us today. Scott Baker is a Senior Consulting Manager with AECOM. He has extensive experience in investment planning for major transportation systems, business process improvements, strategic, operational, and information technology systems, organizational assessment and review, financial planning for transportation entities, and innovative contracting. Mr. Baker has a combination of national consulting experience on major transit issues and hands-on experience based on years of line responsibility for operations and asset management at San Antonio's VIA Metropolitan Transit and Pittsburgh's Port Authority of Allegheny County. He is adept at integrating agency service, project, fleet, facility, technology, financial, and labor relations planning. His experience as a line manager responsible for rail and bus operations and asset management has been applied in two recent projects to formulate advice to FTA on asset management and to develop the National Transit Institute Introduction to Transit Asset Management training program. Rick Laver is Director of Transit Asset Management with CH2M Hill. He has more than 20 years of transit industry experience focusing on asset management, state of good repair assessment, capital and O&M cost modeling, and financial analysis. Mr. Laver has developed and applied SGR decision support tools for a broad variety of U.S. transportation agencies, including FTA, Chicago RTA, San Francisco MTC, Illinois DOT, and many local transit operators. Mr. Laver has also led asset condition assessment and asset inventory development assignments conducted to support long-term SGR needs assessments. And Robert Peskin, Ph.D., is Senior Consulting Manager in the Transportation Consulting Practice of AECOM. Dr. Peskin has 35 years of experience in the areas of transportation financing, planning, and management. He pioneered analytic methodologies in the areas of transportation financial planning, analysis of transportation infrastructure capital needs, and operating and maintenance cost modeling. His work focuses on the application of quantitative information to support transportation decision-making. He works with public agency staff in integrating financial, capital, and operating data from all functional areas, including planning, engineering, transportation, and maintenance. He develops slides and instructor notes and teaches NTI's Introduction to Transit Asset Management and Financial Planning in Transportation courses. Now, I will turn the presentation over to Scott.
Thank you, Judy, and welcome all. I'm really sorry we can't see each other because I think it would be something of a reunion. Most of you, or virtually all of you, have attended one of the two-day courses that Rick and Bob and I have been delivering. What we wanted to do today is get a chance to get you to ask some tough questions about experiences you've had implementing some of the concepts or other comments and questions related to state of good repair and asset management. So the objectives are to review what we covered in the course, just touch briefly on MAP 21, the new legislation that does directly address asset management. And in the spirit of this update and review, Southwest Transit Authority, Len Simich and his crew from just outside the Twin Cities have offered to step forward with their perspective, which I think you'll find is in some ways very typical of a typical transit agency, and in other ways somewhat of a unique perspective. And then the most important part, and what we reserve the most time for, is the participant discussion and questions. So just to review the course, remind you of what the 2 days were about. We covered asset management definition and principles, we talked about asset management planning and the benefits of asset management and spent quite a bit of time on key performance indicators. I wanted to dwell again on the definitions a little bit because I think that in addition to keeping us on topic, if we can really get a clear agreement on definitions, a lot of the rest is fairly mechanical. If you understand what we're trying to do, how we go about it is not as unclear. So the first definition on the screen is the one that we used in the course. It basically says asset management is using business and engineering processes to do what we think is right. The second definition is from Map 21, the highway portion of Map 21, and it introduces this idea of managing the assets at the minimum practicable cost over their life cycle. And the third definition is from the International Infrastructure Management Manual, which you may remember was a resource we used in the course. To the minimum cost concept, it adds the present and future customers. The pre-MAP 21 FTA requirements were covered in the course, and then MAP 21 does directly address the asset management topic. It requires FTA to develop a national asset management program. It requires recipients and subrecipients to have asset management plans. It requires that designated recipients report on the condition and change in condition of assets. It requires each recipient to establish targets and each designated recipient to report on the targets, and then has National Transit Database condition reports provided for on assets. These are clearly brand new requirements. We gave you in the course a reference to the FTA website and the rich body of materials on asset management there in the FTA website, and there is material there also summarizing the MAP 21 requirements, but FTA has told us that while the implementation process is underway, it's likely to be some time before there are any specifics on how these requirements are going to be implemented. Briefly, the principles require some policy buy-in. The asset management process has to be performance-based, based on the asset availability, reliability at each agency. It's a business decision-making process that evaluates trade-offs. The data quality and integrity is critical. It's a data-driven process, and it's transparent in the sense that anyone can question a maintenance or capital renewal decision and be given the data and the analysis that shows that that decision is the optimal one. And perhaps most important, it's integrated. Particularly in the U.S. transit industry, I think it's important that it's integrated between maintenance and capital programs so that they are both data-driven and they're coordinated with each other. And then we introduced this framework, which is a typical process implementation framework, suggesting you can start at a logical starting place with a portion of the system and go through a plan, do, check, and revise type cycle to improve your process as you go along. The benefits are low costs, more consistent performance and reliability, more consistent safety, and transparency that can even assist in getting the requisite funding. And we did talk quite a bit about the target concept that comes up in MAP 21 and the key performance indicators, suggesting that those were ways to link the agency. We used the example of the New York City Transit Agency's fleet that was incurring failures at the rate of more than a failure per 10,000 miles. They adopted this target of 100,000 miles per failure and united the organization and the processes behind achieving that, and were able to not only achieve it but significantly exceed it over time. We also talked about this maturity kind of approach, moving from a maintenance-based emphasis to a life cycle cost emphasis, and finally a risk-based approach over time, with the key being that the time dimension is decades. It's not years or even months. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Rick Laver to talk about the asset management plan process and a few of the key steps in that process.
Great, thank you, Scott. As Scott just noted, this slide presents the 10 general steps that were included in the course for developing an asset management plan. I think it's helpful to reflect on, Scott also talked about the MAP 21 requirements. It is a MAP 21 requirement to develop an asset management plan. And now, although the exact specifications for that plan haven't been laid out, I think this 10-step process, as a grantee, as you make your way through this process and you can work on each of these 10 steps, address each of them, I think you'd be in pretty good shape for addressing whatever requirement FTA is likely to come up with for asset management requirement. That said, the process consists of the 4 boxes off to the right. The first 4 steps are really about identifying what you have, what condition it's in, what you need to do to keep it in good serviceable condition, to keep it on the street, keep it in service. The next 2 steps, 5 and 6, are about identifying what level of service you want to put out there, what you find acceptable, what quality of service you want to deliver to your customers, and what are your risks to attaining that level of service, given you understand what you have and what level of service you want to provide and what the risks are to that level of service. The next issues are what's it going to cost you. And there's a couple of slides to follow shortly on minimizing and optimizing your O&M and capital costs to get to, again, as Scott mentioned, the least cost outcome, getting the maximum results from the minimum amount of dollars possible. And then finally, addressing your funding strategy. And you have to live with the funding capacity you have. So really, you're up against sort of 3 things in my mind. One is, what's the level of service you want to provide? What assets do you have to provide it? What are the conditions of those assets? And then what are the financial resources you have to deliver that level of service? Putting all those pieces together, and finding a way to provide all those pieces together is what the asset management plan is all about. So the pieces that are highlighted in yellow here are the pieces I'm going to focus on, or the steps I'll focus on in the following slides. This next slide is an example of a condition assessment process or a rating system. It's a 1 to 5 system. 1 to 5, 1 to 4 systems are very popular with rating conditions of assets. And this specific example looks at 4 different criteria for rating those assets: age, condition, performance, and so on. The idea being that you would score each asset on each of these criteria on the 1 to 5 scale and then come up with a weighted average measure. It's important to note here again that condition assessment is also another one of these pieces that is required along with an inventory. By the way, under MAP 21, you were expected to have both these pieces, and yet at the same time, there's no industry standard and certainly no specific requirement for how you might go about conducting a condition assessment. I like to think of this example as a very good best practice example, but again, there's no specific requirement at this point or even industry standard for how to go about it. Life cycle cost was also covered in the course. Understanding and managing your life cycle costs is a critical aspect of asset management. That includes all costs from initial purchase of the asset through operating, maintaining, replacing, rehabbing, soft costs, all of these. It's important to understand these costs well and to determine cost optimums. When's the optimal useful life for your asset based on the cost experience you have? And I think a good example here, I'm sure we covered it, is like a 40-foot bus. Given the requirements you have for your vehicle in terms of number of riders, number of miles, the service environment, and so on, is it best for you to just keep a 40-foot bus for 12 years without rehabbing it and then retire it? Or given your service demands, do you need to do more? Do you need to do multiple rehabs? And maybe you might work to a different service life, 12, 13, 14, 15, based on what optimizes and minimizes your costs. Again, understanding your life cycle cost is critical to getting there. Establishing quality of service targets was also something we covered in the course. Again, this is directly related in MAP 21 terminology to performance measures and performance standards for your assets as they relate to state of good repair. So the issue here is, again, how do you want your assets to perform? What's the minimum level of acceptable quality, and also what's attainable given the current condition of the assets and your resources, your O&M and capital resources? What can you actually attain in terms of service quality? I love the example here for elevator system availability, because to my mind it ties the state of good repair or the condition of the asset to an actual service outcome experienced by a user. So I tend to prefer those measures. That's high reliability, safety, security, rider comfort to the condition of the asset. The next two slides focus on optimizing O&M cost expenditures. Again, a key issue with asset management is to minimize your costs. The example that was covered in the course was optimizing the relationship between preventive maintenance and corrective maintenance. We can think about optimizing O&M costs in a broader context, but this example is pretty illustrative. You may remember the example. The declining blue line shows that as you reduce preventive maintenance, you do less preventive maintenance or space out your preventive maintenance inspections. It's going to be a lower cost item to you. But at the same time, you run the risk of missing some things, missing some issues, leading to perhaps asset failures or service failures that will lead to increased in corrective maintenance cost or cost to your riders in terms of missed buses and delayed trips. So between those two, there's those costs. There's an optimum which minimizes the overall cost impact to the agency of conducting preventive and corrective maintenance together. Similarly, for capital investments, there's the concept of optimizing costs, and in the bullets presented here, you see all costs across the entire life cycle, both capital and operating, and the ultimate objective really should be to minimize as much as possible total life cycle cost across the entire life cycle of the asset. Sometimes this is constrained by existing funding, the types of funding that are available, and you may not be able to replace all assets on time or as desired. At that point, it becomes more of an issue of prioritizing which assets you can address versus those which may need to be delayed, whose needs need to be delayed given the limitations on funding. And with that, I will pass it on to Bob Peskin.
Thank you, Rick. During the course, we suggested an analytical process, and we had a flow chart which showed how to apply the principles of asset management in the context of developing an overall agency financial plan, a financial plan that is centered on a financial analysis model that integrates projections of expenses and revenues, both capital and operating. That flow chart we've evolved a bit since we taught the course. So what we're going to show you here is similar concepts, but showing some application that a couple of transit agencies have applied recently. I want to focus on the role of transit asset management as part of the application of an overall financial analysis process. As Rick mentioned earlier, these analyses are, and MAP 21 calls for this, that they're asset inventory based. So we start with the assets that we own, and we apply them in an analytical structure in a asset management model, which includes, as part of its decision making, an understanding of how the assets age over time using asset decay functions, which relate asset age to asset performance or asset condition. And the outcome of that is a projection of future needs, mostly on the capital side, that flow into the financial analysis model. In the meantime, in the context of many transit agencies, the financial plan is being developed in the context of expanding service in addition to investing in what we already have. And those assets are also applied in the transit asset management model to project future needs. And of course, there's the construction cost to build these expansions to the system. On the operating side, we know how much service we're going to be providing, and that, along with the current experience in terms of unit operating and maintenance costs, allows us to project future operating costs. But we also recognize that the existing assets are aging over time, and as those assets age, there may be a change in the unit O&M cost. In other words, what it costs today to maintain your fleet may not be what it costs you to maintain your fleet in the future if you're not buying any more buses and the fleet is aging over time. So those relationships should also be addressed in the financial plan. On the revenue side, there are capital sources of funding from intergovernmental grants and various dedicated sources. And on the operating side, there is operating revenues coming from fares and operating revenues coming from a variety of other sources. So this is the overall picture of what the financial plan looks like and the role that asset management has in the development of that plan. Zooming in a little bit on the notion of the application of an analytical tool to support this decision making, we can think about ways to apply an asset management model in two contexts, a constrained and an unconstrained context. In an unconstrained context where the needs are fully funded, we start with the assets and those asset decay functions which relate asset age to asset performance or condition. And coming out of that is an understanding of what the current backlog is, that is, what assets are currently beyond their useful life, and what future needs will be to keep all the assets within their useful life or at a state of good repair. That's the unconstrained context. In a constrained analysis, rather than having unconstrained funding, we have constrained funding. And we apply that into the analytical tool. We apply the same assets and decay functions. And then recognizing that we're going to have future needs that can't fully be funded, we need to prioritize those needs to determine what does get funded on time and what doesn't. As applied in many transit agencies, that's been a consideration of asset age and cost effectiveness and other factors, which in this example included seismic and climate change vulnerability, but could include other considerations generally tied to an agency's set of strategic goals. So considerations of safety and security and passenger comfort and employee welfare and response to regulatory demand, etc., all help determine, given that we have constrained funding, what projects get funded on time and which ones do not. The ones that do get funded then get applied in the financial analysis model as described in the prior slide, which gives us a fiscally constrained plan. The projects that don't get funded result in future asset condition maybe not being as good as it is today. And there's a variety of ways that we can measure what that future asset condition is. And remember that MAP 21 is looking for agencies to identify a set of performance targets. And some of those performance targets could be the types of measures that we've suggested here on this slide. This next slide shows a set of results from the application of an asset management tool on a transit agency. And here we're showing in an unconstrained context, here's what the future needs would be for this agency by asset class. We see a relatively large peak on the front end, which is addressing the current backlog, spending the money necessary to meet that backlog, frankly, as fast as the projects could be implemented, recognizing that many of the current backlog projects could not be implemented right away. In developing the asset management plan, quite often it's very useful to consider how to group projects together. Considerations of constructability become important. So here we have an example of a maintenance facility for a light rail system, and we've identified that various elements of the heating, ventilating, and air conditioning system need to be replaced, and the roof needs to be replaced. And as it turns out, in this example, they needed to be replaced at about the same time. And a simple constructability consideration was, well, you need to rent a truck to lift the roofing materials up to the roof, and you need a crane to also remove the roof-mounted equipment. Let's rent that crane only once, do everything together, so the project was implemented at about the same time to deal with all these asset subclasses at the same time. This next slide shows the results of the application of a asset management model at one agency. We see on that 1 to 5 scale that Rick talked about earlier in this presentation that overall this particular agency, the average condition of the assets on a 1 to 5 scale was just under 3.2. And we explored 3 alternative funding levels, a funding level of $163 million a year, $366 million a year, and $432 million a year. And we see what the resulting condition of the assets are over time. And using the analytical tool, we were able to see, well, how would the decision-making change and the resulting condition of assets change if we base the decision-making primarily on age or primarily on other strategic goals or some combination of the two, and we see what the distribution is. This particular agency, the financial plan, ended up being this particular financial plan here, and we see that the assets that began at this condition level ended up at that condition level, actually a modest improvement in condition. So an example of the application of these principles.
Our next presenters are from Southwest Transit. I will introduce Len Simich, and he will introduce his staff. Len Simich has served as the Chief Executive Officer of the Southwest Transit Commission since 1997. As CEO, he oversees the management of all aspects of the agency, including operations, planning, marketing, financial management, human resources, contract negotiations, legislative outreach, and real estate development. Under Mr. Simich's leadership, Southwest Transit has been honored as the National Transit System of the Year by the American Public Transportation Association, as a two-time winner of the Minnesota Transit System of the Year by the Minnesota Public Transit Association, a two-time recipient of the Minnesota Management Innovation Award, a five-time national award winner as the nation's top transit agency for safety and security, and as the recipient of the National Environmental Excellence Award given out by the National Federal Highway Administration. Thank you, Len, for presenting for us.
Maybe just to start, in the beginning we talked about a showcase. I don't think we have much to showcase yet, but we're happy to share our experiences trying to get this program up and running, some of the things that we have discovered, some of the problems, some of the issues we've experienced, and kind of where we're going from here. To start, we are a small transit property. I suspect a lot smaller than the majority of the people that are with us today. However, even though we are small, I felt personally that it was critical for us to get a handle on our assets, specifically what it's going to take for us to continue to hit our performance targets and what we need to budget for in the future for significant refurbishment and or replacement. Just want to talk briefly about this slide. I do have members of our team that will be joining me in the presentation. Steve LaFrance, our Director of Facilities and Maintenance, and Gary Hay, who is a Principal Architect with Hay Dobbs and Associates, and they specialize in not only architecture and planning, but also have done a lot in the field of asset management with area universities. You'll see a number of other names on there, and the reason I put those all on there is these are the folks in our organization that are involved in this project. Now, it may not seem much for, again, a larger system, but outside of mechanics, a few customer service members, and our facility maintenance people, this is our organization. So we have everybody pretty much involved, and there's pros and cons to this approach presentation. First, a little bit about Southwest Transit. As I mentioned, we are a suburban express provider, provide a little over 1.2 million rides annually. We do pride ourselves on the high level of customer service and system reliability, and you mentioned some of the awards that we have received. The one thing that we also are very proud of, we have a 99% customer satisfaction rating, which we measure annually with all of our customers through an onboard survey, so we're extremely proud of that. Who we serve, I think it will be really clear as to why we feel it's very important to continue down this path, because we have set some high standards, and we have to keep those high standards if we really expect to continue to draw people to our services. 80% of our residents have 2 or more vehicles. The commutes are fairly long, so they're on our bus for a good deal of time. Residents, the majority of the residents have household incomes of $100,000 or more. So you can see it's a very affluent area. And one of the things that struck me in the training is when we talk a lot, at least in our course, about the image or the stain factor, because again, this is extremely important to my organization. As for funding, annually our operating budget is going to be somewhere around the $8 to $9 million range. We'll have capital budgets that are all over the place as well. It really depends on what type of activity, or if we're in the process of buying buses and so forth. So that can range. The highest in one given year, I think we were at 22 to 24 million. But the bulk of our funding, from an operating standpoint here in the state of Minnesota, we receive money through the motor vehicle sales tax, and then we recover 33% through our fare box. On the capital side, we get very small amount of federal formula funds. The rest of the funds here, for the most part, are under a competitive nature. We have done well in the past, but that's no indication how we will do going forward, and most of that has been for expansion, really not for preservation and maintenance. So again, this project that we're undertaking is very important to us. We also, I should mention that we do a little bit of self-financing. In the bio, it did mention we are involved in real estate. We have a real estate arm of this organization, and up through, I'd say, 2008, we were very successful. But since the recession here, things have not really produced like they had previously. Why we're developing the plan? Well, I think it's, again, pretty clear. In 1997, when I came into the organization, we virtually had no assets. We were doing everything under a contract basis. Today we have a little over $60 million in assets. So we are a relatively young organization, but we're now at that time where we need to replace and refurbish our fleet and facilities. The funding, as I mentioned, is unstable, and for us to continue to go forward without bankrupting the organization, we have to make sure we have a good plan in place. Up to now, we haven't really had the classic engineering or business approach. I'll call it more of a political approach, and we've done just fine by that. But times are changing, especially in our state, where we once had a lot of political clout. Our leverage has been significantly reduced. So in terms of going to the state legislature and looking for assistance that way, I think those days are over, at least for a while. As for our assets, 61 buses, primarily use commuter coaches. We have some non-revenue vehicles, facility maintenance equipment. One of the things that sets us apart a little bit from a lot of other smaller organizations, we do operate a lot of structured parking garages as well as transit stations. Significant cost, not only the front-end cost to construct these, but to maintain these on a yearly basis. And then we do operate out of two maintenance facilities. One is a full-fledged where all of our maintenance, facility maintenance takes place. The other one is primarily used for some storage and some lease revenue as we lease out a portion of that facility. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to kind of turn it over to Steve and Gary. They're going to kind of take you through a little bit of the nuts and bolts of where we're at today, and then I'll follow it up kind of what we've learned.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Len. This is Steve LaFrance, Director of Maintenance and Facilities. Our process to date, we've sent several people to the NTI course so that we could, as Len said, most of the people in our organization are involved with this. So that was the place we started, and then we got together after everybody had attended and decided who would take which roles in the process. At that meeting, it was decided that we should start with one of our facilities and our rolling stock, revenue and non-revenue. So we also decided there was a need for a central spot to bring all this information together. So it was determined that an access database would be right for us, and that we had staff available that had the skill to be able to put this together. So that's the direction we headed. There's a lot of conversation on what components of different systems should or should not be included in our asset inventory. Probably one of the most difficult things that we ran into with each subgroup that we got together with and discussed what we needed to include in our spreadsheets on gathering our information. And that's probably one of the things you're going to find are the most difficult areas also. We kind of decided that we would find a dollar threshold and pretty much try to stay above that dollar threshold as far as what the value of each asset was. But that wasn't a solid plan either, because there's still items that we found that had a small value in itself, but when you combine them all together, they still end up with a large value. And in our case, we looked at two-way radios. A two-way radio is about $2,500 each, but if we were to have to replace all our radios at one shot, you're looking, $175,000 to $200,000. So that's a significant value. We kind of put together this access database after we had put our information into spreadsheets using the rating categories that were given to us at the NTI course. We input that information into this spreadsheet example that you see here, this input worksheet or form that's in our access database. And what we intend to have happen with that is to give us a place where we can go to generate reports to find out our various cost categories and to put things together in a way that we can understand them. I don't know if Gary wants to add in on some of the items that we had where we were trying to compile our subcategories.
In general, the slide that you're looking at was the large general for each one of the subcategories for each of the facility assets. As Len had mentioned, the various parking garage maintenance facilities and then also surface parking rides as well. Under each one of these subcategories that you see, we actually have additional subsystems. So we can break this down into a much finer grain. So when we look at the building envelope, for instance, we can also look at window and door replacement, caulking on joints, and we can get to a great level of detail, which helps us understand our sort of long-term and then yearly maintenance costs. Through the spreadsheet, we're also in the process of developing the overall calculated replacement value for each one of the facilities, as well as being able to look at what is fundable and those items that aren't, that we have to first start to look at renewal costs as they relate to each one of the facilities as well. So this access database really provides us a lot of detailed information related to each one of the facility assets here at the system.
So here is an example of what we ended up with. This is pretty much a small sampling of how that listing ended up looking.
And so I guess what I'll do is just follow up a little bit on what we've learned through the process. As I mentioned, we have a number of folks throughout the organization involved. I think there's a benefit of doing that and doing it internally. It gives everybody a good base understanding of what we're doing and why we're doing it. But there are some pitfalls. And one is, how do you keep this a priority at the time when you have all the other fires to put out running an operation? And that has been somewhat problematic, where nobody has this as just their principal assignment. And to keep on timelines has been again, somewhat problematic. It's led to the real need to maintain this high level of coordination. And we unfortunately have learned this the hard way, where we've had to stop and start a number of times. And when you start up on something again where it's new, you kind of lose ground. So I think hopefully we've overcome that, but those were some of those internal problems that we've had. Steve mentioned about the definition of an asset. What are we establishing as our thresholds? What should be included in the plan? I just keep on coming back to, I need something as we go forward from a budgetary standpoint. Identify how do we maintain what we have at the levels that we need, and when is it the optimum time to replace or refurbish. So again, I'll have a benchmark from a budgeting standpoint. These things can get very technical, as you can see, and we've taken it in some cases into a whole technical realm. But bottom line is, when it comes back to me and I have to sell to a board, those are the two major things that I'm looking at. So that's just some of the things. Again, we are just touching our full program here and we hope to have it wrapped up within really the next 6 months. So our whole next budgetary cycle, it'll be in place. So that's what we have to date, and I'll turn it back to Judy. I think ultimately it's going to benefit us, but there has been some struggles along the way, which I'll talk to as we go through the.
Thank you to all of our presenters for very informative presentations and for very extensive answers to the questions that came in.